The USS Abraham Lincoln cut through the Pacific waters like a blade through silk, its massive nuclear-powered hull displacing thousands of tons of ocean as it made its way back to Naval Base Kitsap. Seaman recruit Tyler Jennings stood on the hangar deck, his crisp new uniform still stiff with that fresh-from-the-package feel, watching the other sailors move around him with the practiced efficiency of people who actually knew what they were doing. He'd been on the carrier for exactly 3 weeks, fresh out of boot camp in Great Lakes, and he was absolutely convinced he had the whole Navy thing figured out. The other recruits in his division thought he was cocky, his division officer thought he was trouble waiting to happen. Tyler thought they were all just jealous because he'd scored higher on the ASVAB than most of them and wasn't afraid to mention it. At 20 years old, with a high school football career that had ended with a knee injury and college prospects that had evaporated with his GPA, the Navy had seemed like his ticket to something bigger, something that would finally prove to everyone back in his small Ohio town that he was destined for greatness. He'd enlisted with visions of becoming a SEAL, or at the very least earning some combat ribbons and coming home with stories that would make him a legend at O'Malley's bar. Reality had been somewhat different. He'd washed out of the SEAL pipeline in the first week, couldn't handle the cold water training, and had been reassigned to the carrier as a deckhand, which was about as unglamorous as Navy life got. But Tyler had convinced himself that this was just temporary, just a stepping stone, and in the meantime he'd found other ways to feel superior. One of those ways was mocking the old janitor who worked in the enlisted mess and the crew quarters. The man was probably in his 70s, maybe older, with silver hair cropped military short and a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. He wore the same blue coveralls every day, pushed the same mop bucket through the same corridors, and never said much to anyone. Tyler had started calling him Pops within the first week, always with that edge of condescension that made it clear the nickname wasn't affectionate. The old man never responded, just kept mopping, kept cleaning, kept his eyes down. That silence had only made Tyler bolder. It started small, the way these things always do, with little comments muttered just loud enough for the janitor to hear as he passed. "Must be nice having such a cushy job, Pops," Tyler would say, leaning against the bulkhead with his arms crossed. "No stress, no responsibility, just push that mop around all day." The other sailors in Tyler's division would sometimes laugh, uncomfortable laughs that came more from not wanting to be the next target than from actually finding it funny. Petty Officer Second Class Martinez, who'd been trying to mentor Tyler since he arrived, had pulled him aside twice to tell him to knock it off. "Show some respect, Jennings," Martinez had said, his dark eyes serious. "You don't know anything about that man." But Tyler had just shrugged it off. What was there to know? The guy was a janitor, probably some veteran who couldn't hack it in the real world after his service, and had come back to the Navy in the only capacity they'd take him. It was actually kind of sad when you thought about it, which Tyler did, often and loudly. The mockery escalated over the following days. Tyler started making a show of stepping around the janitor's freshly mopped floors, exaggerating his movements like he was navigating an obstacle course. "Whoa, careful everyone, Pop's just mopped here, wouldn't want to mess up his masterpiece." He'd laugh at his own jokes, and sometimes he'd get a few chuckles from the younger sailors, the ones who were just as green as he was and just as desperate to feel like they belonged somewhere in the hierarchy. The old man never reacted. He'd just wring out his mop, move to the next section, keep working with the kind of methodical precision that Tyler interpreted as slowness, as someone who'd given up on having any real ambition. Once Tyler had actually kicked over the janitor's bucket, not hard enough to spill it completely, but enough to slosh water across the deck. "Oops," he'd said, grinning. "Guess you'll have to mop that up again, Pops." The janitor had simply righted the bucket, refilled it from the nearby spigot, and started cleaning up the water without a word, without even a glance in Tyler's direction. That had infuriated Tyler more than a confrontation would have. Who did this old man think he was, ignoring him like that? Didn't he understand that Tyler was a sailor, part of the ship's crew, while he was just a civilian contractor mopping floors? Everything changed on a Thursday afternoon during a routine safety drill. The entire ship had been called to general quarters, and Tyler was scrambling to get to his assigned station in damage control when he rounded a corner and nearly collided with the janitor. The old man was carrying his mop bucket, moving at his usual unhurried pace despite the blaring alarm and the pounding of hundreds of feet against metal decks. "Get out of the way, Pops," Tyler shouted, shoving past him roughly enough that some water slopped from the bucket. "Some of us have actual jobs to do." The janitor stumbled slightly but caught himself against the bulkhead. For the first time since Tyler had been on the ship, the old man looked directly at him. His eyes were a startling pale blue, and there was something in them that made Tyler's stomach clench, though he couldn't have said why. But the moment passed, the alarm was still screaming, and Tyler was already late. He ran off without another glance, leaving the janitor standing in the corridor. The drill went badly for Tyler. He'd mixed up 2 of the valve procedures and had been chewed out by the damage control chief in front of half his division. By the time he made it back to the enlisted mess for dinner, he was in a foul mood and looking for someone to take it out on. The janitor was there, as always, mopping near the serving line. Tyler loaded up his tray and deliberately walked through the wet section of floor, leaving muddy boot prints across the clean surface. "Mr. Spot, Pops," he called over his shoulder. Several sailors looked up from their meals, and Tyler saw Martinez shaking his head in disgust. But there was someone else watching too, someone Tyler hadn't noticed before. Commander Robert Hayes, the ship's executive officer, was standing near the bulkhead with a cup of coffee, and his face had gone very still. He watched the janitor bend down to clean up Tyler's boot prints, then his eyes tracked to Tyler, who was now sitting at a table and laughing with 2 other junior sailors. Commander Hayes set down his coffee, walked over to the janitor, and said something quietly. The old man looked up, shook his head slightly, and went back to mopping. The commander stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked straight toward Tyler's table. "Seaman Recruit Jennings," Commander Hayes said, his voice cutting through the mess hall chatter like a knife. Tyler looked up, his fork halfway to his mouth, and felt his heart drop into his stomach. Officers didn't usually talk to junior enlisted unless something was very wrong. He stood up so fast, he almost knocked over his tray, snapping to attention. "Sir, yes sir." The commander's face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that reminded Tyler uncomfortably of his high school football coach right before he kicked someone off the team. "I've been watching you interact with our maintenance personnel," Hayes said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent mess hall, "and I'm wondering if you have any idea who that man is." Tyler glanced over at the janitor, who had his back turned and was still mopping, apparently oblivious to the conversation. "He's just the janitor, sir," Tyler said, confused about why this was even a discussion. The commander's jaw tightened. "That janitor is Frank Morrison, Captain Frank Morrison, retired, United States Navy. He commanded 3 different submarines over a 28-year career, including the USS Hartford during some of the most classified operations of the Cold War. He's a recipient of the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit with 2 gold stars, and the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. He's forgotten more about leadership and the Navy than you will ever learn." The mess hall had gone completely silent now. Tyler felt the blood draining from his face. "Sir, I didn't." "You didn't what?" "Didn't know? Didn't think to show basic human decency to someone regardless of what job they're doing? Didn't consider that maybe, just maybe, there are people on this ship who've earned more respect in one day than you have in your entire life?" Commander Hayes took a step closer, and Tyler had to fight the urge to back up. "Captain Morrison retired 8 years ago. He lost his wife to cancer 2 years after that. He came back to work on this carrier not because he needs the money, but because he loves the Navy and wanted to contribute something, even if it was just keeping the decks clean. He's been here for 3 years, and every officer on this ship knows who he is. Every chief knows who he is. Most of the senior enlisted know who he is, but apparently smart sailors like you who think they've got it all figured out don't bother to learn anything about the people around them." Tyler felt like he was going to be sick. Around him he could feel every eye in the mess hall boring into him, judging him, watching him get torn apart by the XO. His 2 table mates had suddenly become very interested in their food trays. Martinez was staring at him with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and vindication. "Sir, I apologize, I had no idea," Tyler started, but Commander Hayes cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't apologize to me. I'm not the one you've been disrespecting for 3 weeks. He pointed toward the janitor, who had finally stopped mopping and was standing still, his hands resting on the mop handle. "That man right there served his country with honor and distinction. He made decisions that affected national security. He commanded crews of over 100 men in conditions that would have broken you in your first hour, and you treated him like garbage because you were too arrogant and too stupid to see past a pair of coveralls." The commander's voice had risen slightly, and Tyler could hear the genuine anger in it now. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk over there, and you're going to apologize properly. Then you're going to report to Master Chief Kowalski, who will assign you to assist Captain Morrison with his duties every day for the next month after your regular watch. You will learn what real work looks like, and you will learn what real humility looks like, because right now you don't know a damn thing about either." Tyler nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He could feel tears of shame burning behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of everyone. Commander Hayes waited, arms crossed, clearly expecting Tyler to move immediately. Tyler forced his legs to work and crossed the mess hall to where the old man stood. Up close, Tyler could see details he'd never noticed before, because he'd never really looked. The man's hands were weathered and scarred, with thick calluses that spoke of decades of physical work. His posture was still military straight, despite his age, and those pale blue eyes, when they met Tyler's, held depths of experience and wisdom that made Tyler feel about 3 inches tall. "Sir," Tyler began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I've been disrespectful and inappropriate since I came aboard. I had no idea who you were, but that's no excuse. Even if you were just a janitor with no military background, I should have treated you with basic human decency. I'm sorry." Captain Morrison studied him for a long moment, and Tyler forced himself not to look away. Finally, the older man nodded slightly. "Apology accepted, son," he said, and his voice was gravelly with age but still carried that unmistakable note of command that came from years of being responsible for other people's lives. "But understanding why you were wrong is more important than just saying you're sorry." He set his mop against the wall and gestured for Tyler to walk with him, away from the dozens of watching eyes. Commander Hayes gave Tyler a hard look but nodded and walked away, apparently satisfied that his point had been made. Tyler followed Captain Morrison out of the mess hall and down a quieter corridor, his heart still pounding with shame and anxiety. They stopped near a viewport that looked out over the dark Pacific waters. "You know what the hardest part of submarine command was?" Captain Morrison asked, not looking at Tyler but at the ocean beyond the glass. Tyler shook his head, not trusting his voice. "It wasn't the technical stuff, though that was complicated enough. It wasn't even the pressure of being hundreds of feet underwater in a tube full of nuclear weapons and a nuclear reactor, knowing that one mistake could kill everyone on board." He paused, and a faint smile crossed his weathered face. It was learning that every single person on that boat mattered. The sonar tech who could hear things in the water that our equipment couldn't detect. The cook who kept morale up with decent food in impossible conditions. The seaman who maintained the bilge pumps. Probably the worst job on the boat, but absolutely critical. Every single one of them was essential. He finally turned to look at Tyler. "You see a janitor and think that job doesn't matter, that the person doing it doesn't matter. But what happens when the decks aren't clean? People slip, people get injured, equipment gets contaminated, little things cascade into big problems. There are no unimportant jobs on a Navy vessel, just like there are no unimportant people." Over the next month, Tyler learned more than he had in his entire time in the Navy up to that point. Every day after his regular watch, he reported to Captain Morrison and spent 4 hours cleaning, maintaining, and learning. At first, it was torture. The work was physically exhausting, requiring constant bending, scrubbing, lifting, and moving. His hands developed blisters that burst and then calloused over. His back ached constantly. But worse than the physical discomfort was the shame that still burned in his chest every time someone walked past and saw him on his hands and knees, scrubbing a deck or cleaning out a head. But Captain Morrison never made it worse. He didn't lecture or berate. He just worked alongside Tyler, showing him the right way to do things, explaining the reasoning behind different maintenance procedures, and occasionally sharing stories from his decades of service. Tyler learned that Captain Morrison had enlisted as a regular sailor just like him before, earning his commission through the Naval Academy. He learned about Cold War patrols where the submarine would stay underwater for months at a time, running silent and deep, playing cat and mouse with Soviet vessels in waters so tense that a single mistake could have started World War III. He learned about the time Morrison's boat had experienced a reactor casualty at depth, and how the crew had worked for 18 straight hours to prevent a catastrophe, with Morrison making split-second decisions that saved all their lives. "Leadership isn't about being better than the people you lead," Morrison told him one evening as they were scrubbing out the industrial sinks in the galley. "It's about making them better, about seeing potential in people even when they don't see it in themselves, about understanding that everyone has value, everyone has something to contribute." Tyler paused in his scrubbing, looking at the old man who was working beside him without complaint, doing a job that was far beneath his qualifications. doing it with dignity and precision. "Why did you come back to do this?" he asked. "After everything you accomplished, why come back to mop floors?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, his hands never stopping their work. "Because I loved the Navy, and I missed being part of something bigger than myself. After my wife died, I was alone in a house that felt too big and too empty. I'd sit there all day with nothing to do but remember everything I'd lost. So I came back. Maybe it's not commanding a submarine, but I'm still serving. I'm still part of the crew, and that means something to me." The month passed faster than Tyler expected. Somewhere along the way, the shame transformed into something else, something that felt like actual learning and growth. He started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before, the way the senior chiefs moved through the ship with quiet confidence, not needing to prove anything to anyone, the way the junior officers sought advice from experienced enlisted personnel, recognizing that rank didn't always equal knowledge, the way the entire massive machine of the carrier functioned because thousands of people did their jobs with precision and care, from the admiral in his quarters to the culinary specialist preparing meals in the galley at 3 in the morning. On his last day working with Captain Morrison, Tyler arrived at their usual meeting point to find the old man waiting with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought we could talk instead of work today," Morrison said, handing one to Tyler. They went up to one of the observation decks, a small platform where off-duty crew sometimes went to watch the ocean and get some air. The sun was setting, painting the Pacific in shades of orange and gold. "You've done good work this month," Morrison said. "Learned faster than I expected. You've got potential, Tyler, real potential, but you've got to get out of your own way." Tyler nodded, staring out at the endless water. "I joined the Navy thinking I was going to be some kind of hero. When I washed out of SEAL training, I felt like a failure. I guess I was taking it out on everyone around me, trying to feel superior because I was so afraid of being worthless." Morrison took a sip of his coffee. "Everybody washes out of something. I flunked my first submarine qualification test, had to take it 3 times before I passed. The difference between people who succeed and people who don't isn't whether they fail, it's whether they learn from it and keep going." He looked at Tyler, and there was something almost fatherly in his expression. "You're young, you made mistakes, but you owned them. That counts for something. Now you've got a choice. You can go back to being the cocky kid who thinks he knows everything, or you can be someone who actually does the work of becoming the sailor you want to be. Your call." 2 years later, Petty Officer 3rd Class Tyler Jennings stood on the quarterdeck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, supervising a working party of new recruits. He watched them move equipment across the hangar deck, some of them working smoothly together, others still figuring it out, all of them so young and green that he had to smile. One of the recruits was giving attitude to a civilian contractor who was cleaning up around the workspace, making snide comments just loud enough to be heard. Tyler recognized that behavior, recognized it with the sharp clarity that comes from having been exactly that person once. He walked over, put a hand on the recruit's shoulder, and said quietly, "Let me tell you about respect and why it matters." Somewhere in the ship's interior spaces, Captain Frank Morrison was probably mopping a deck or cleaning a head, doing the work that kept the Navy running, doing it with dignity and purpose, and Tyler was grateful beyond words that he'd learned the lesson before it was too late.